Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm delighted to participate in this debate today, and I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Argyll and Bute for bringing this important matter to the floor of the House. Life for citizens living under the Bahraini regime must give all of us who believe in democratic values deep cause for concern. Those who criticise the regime in Bahrain are subjected to the most cruel and random treatment that is an affront to all that is decent. As we've heard today, unfair trials of protesters and critics of the regime, ill treatment of detainees, which is tantamount to torture, the fabrication of evidence against those in custody, minority groups targeted, the use of the death penalty, the suppression of freedom of expression, even reports of rape and electric shock treatments for detainees, some of whom are juveniles. That is the ugly story of life under the current regime in Bahrain. We're all aware of the Aiza town prison, the only female detention facility in Bahrain, where female prisoners have politically motivated human rights violations such as being denied medical care, physical and psychological abuse, threats of sexual violence and religious discrimination, as well as arbitrary detention and collective punishment. No one should be an apologist for that regime, certainly not from the comfort of the Westminster benches. We can also consider the case of Mr Alsan Gassi. Now, we've heard much about Mr Alsan Gassi this afternoon, a 59-year-old academic languishing in prison following his peaceful opposition to Bahraini's dictatorship during the 2011 Arab Spring. Having already endured degrading treatment and torture, suffering medical negligence, enduring the indignity of being denied sanitation facilities and currently on hunger strike, facing a slow death in prison. And what do we hear from the UK government? Well, what we know is that it has hosted meetings with Bahraini officials, but appears to have exercised no influence over the regime, but remains a staunch ally. Well, given that the government is an ally of this regime, what does that say about the so-called old-fashioned British values we hear about? Whatever action the UK government is prepared to take against the Bahraini regime, whatever influence it is prepared to bring to bear, that is a choice. And to refuse to take any action against the regime or refuse to use your influence, that is also a choice. I fully support Early Day Motion 578 calling for the UK government to impose Magnitsky sanctions on those responsible for the unlawful imprisonment of Dr Alsan Gassi, and I'm sure that many people in this House have also supported that motion. But I remember on the 6th of July 2020, the fanfare around the launch of the UK government's global human rights sanctions regime, which meant the Foreign Secretary would have the power to sanction persons implicated in human rights abuses anywhere across the globe. And yet, Bahraini leaders such as General Rashid bin Abdullah Al Khalifa have been hosted by senior members of this government who are and people like him are deeply implicated in the torture of some of their own citizens in Bahrain. And it is even more curious that whilst the UK government was cutting humanitarian aid by billions last year, including for clean water and nutrition, its support for the Gulf Strategy Fund, the former Integrated Activity Fund, increased by 154%. The Integrated Activity Fund has been completely discredited due to its lack of transparency and links to regimes with dubious human rights records, such as Bahrain. So I hope that when he gets to his feet, the Minister can explain how the flagrant human rights abuses perpetrated by the Bahrain regime leaders are impacting on its relationship with the UK. Is it impacting at all? Bahrain leaders are still feted by UK government officials, and money is increasingly finding its way into Bahrain from the UK. So where does that leave the UK's relationship with this barbaric regime? It looks for all the world as though the UK government, for all its pretensions to be a global supporter of human rights, is content to turn a blind eye to these appalling human rights abuses when it suits. By maintaining unconditional political and economic support for the Bahrain regime, the UK government is enabling and facilitating brutality and repression in that country. What we need to know is for the UK government to be much more transparent about which projects the UK funds in Bahrain, with human rights assessment for each. Failure to do so can only heighten concerns. A public inquiry into whether the Integrated Activity Fund, now the Gulf Strategy Fund, has propped up regimes with poor human rights record is critical. However, whilst the pressure for this inquiry grows, the fund continues to operate despite billions of pounds of cuts to international aid spending by this government. And it's disgraceful that the UK's Ministry of Defence has carried out training programmes with Bahraini military forces, notwithstanding the fact that Bahrain is on the Foreign Office Human Rights Watch list. The UK government needs to send a clear and robust signal that the human rights abuses in Bahrain are not acceptable. It must look to its funding mechanisms and its inaction and stop conferring legitimacy on this appallingly cruel and barbaric regime. We too often hear of the UK government trumpeting its role as a force for good in the world. Words are not enough. All funding for Bahraini programmes which are not focused on poverty alleviation must be suspended until we have much greater transparency around these programmes. We need the UK government to introduce a resolution addressing human rights violations in Bahrain at the UN Human Rights Council. And we need a UN-led commission to investigate torture within Bahrain, which allows access to prisons. As long as Bahrain denies access to independent human rights monitors, including Amnesty, we can be sure the regime continues to torture and otherwise mistreat its citizens. The argument I have heard today that there are worse regimes in Bahrain will offer no comfort and should offer no comfort to those who have suffered barbaric treatment under that regime. It's time for the UK to do the right thing and put its money where its mouth is. If it wants to be a force for good in the world, as it often says it does, it cannot choose to pass by on the other side while those in Bahrain standing up for freedom are brutalised. Now, I hope the UK government will use every diplomatic and financial tool at its disposal to effect greater respect for human rights in Bahrain. Our own respect for human rights demands nothing less.
Yeah.